welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today is a very exciting day. The day that this goes live, May 31st, I hope, is the 1-year anniversary of this podcast. My first episode was released on June 1st, so almost a year, but the 1-year anniversary of Good Grief with Nikki the Death Doula. So yay! Looking back on this year, it went really quickly. Yeah, I just remember thinking I could do this forever, but then about, maybe a month or two in, I was like, am I going to have enough topic ideas to keep this going? And here we are a year later, and I still have a list on my computer with like 30 more ideas, and that doesn't even count interviews I hopefully will be doing. So I have a couple people in mind I'm going to reach out to, but if you have a story you'd like to tell about a loss or a grief of any type, please, reach out to me. Let me know. I'd love to hear your story, and our listeners would love to hear your story. And who knows, maybe somebody out there has suffered something very similar to you and would A, feel better, and B, just appreciate hearing, from somebody else who went through something very similar to them. So yeah. Gosh, thank you. A huge thank you to all my listeners who have been with me since the beginning. So, and my podcast has grown a little, but this has mostly been a labor of love. Now, you probably, if you're listening to this on any normal platform that's not Patreon, you may hear me talking about BetterHelp. That is a sponsorship that I, reached out and received. However, that's full disclosure. That's one of the sponsorships. I don't actually get any money unless somebody utilizes the link that I share. So I still have not made a single penny on this podcast, and that's okay. Would I like to make money on it? Of course I would. This podcast is a lot of work. I'm not going to say this takes me this takes me, for each episode, even the ones that are only 15 minutes long, each episode takes me several hours of work because, it's an hour or so of me recording. However long I record, if it's, 30 minutes of recording, it's going to be twice as long to edit. So there's all the editing involved. I have to post it in several different places, write out the descriptions, get the links. And I put it on YouTube as well, so I have to make some type of video to go with the audio to put on YouTube. And I have to put things on Patreon, cut the ads out. So it's very labor intensive. It is a lot of work. And would I like to make money on this? I mean, sure, that'd be nice, but just, full transparency and to be clear, that's not why I started this podcast. I didn't start this out to make money. I really didn't. Sure, like I said, it would be nice to get some kind of recoupment for this, but if I don't, I'm not going to stop doing this if I don't get, 1 billion followers and plenty of income each month from it. I will continue to do this podcast as long as I am able, so you all know. That said, if you really enjoy what I do and you believe in this, I would love to have you as a Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula, and I send out grief affirmations twice a week. You get early access to the podcast. You get to listen to my cat whine. And the podcast episodes I put on Patreon are ad-free if you don't like listening to the ads. So just some thoughts, just putting that out there. Another wonderful thing you could do for me would just be spread the word. Please tell people about, if you really, really do enjoy this podcast, tell your friends, family, whatever. Share it on social media. I post stuff on my socials all the time about this podcast. So feel free to share those posts or, interact with them, whatever. Tag people in them that you think might appreciate a certain episode. If you don't like this podcast, I don't know why you're still listening right now. So, go find something else to do. It's okay. You're allowed to not like it. Okay. All right. So this podcast is not my blog. So let's get into the episode for today. So today we are talking about acceptance and denial. There was a beautiful article I read through ENELDA, which is where I received my training for my doula work. INELDA stands for the International End-of-Life Doula Association, if I haven't said that before. But there's a beautiful article that was sent out called Acceptance, Denial, and Related Responses to Death. And it talked a whole lot about acceptance and denial, which you go back and listen to my episode on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Talked about the stages of grief. It's just called the stages of grief. And remember, those aren't steps and they're not in order. Those are just stages you may go through at different times in relation to your grief. Okay. The problem with denial and acceptance when it comes to response to a loss, it doesn't necessarily have to be a death, but any type of loss, is typically denial is looked on poorly. It's looked on as a quote unquote bad reaction. And acceptance is a quote good reaction, and it's looked upon more favorably. But that's not necessarily the case. Denial doesn't have to be bad, and acceptance isn't always good. So let's pick that apart a little bit, shall we? Well, first of all, if you misunderstood Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, and you're putting them in order, which you're not supposed to, denial comes first, acceptance comes last. So it's like you start out, no, this isn't happening, and then, okay, it's happening, and that's good. Well, not always, and those don't always happen in that order. Some people are accepting immediately, especially when it comes to like a terminal diagnosis. Maybe they've been sick for a long time, and they receive this diagnosis, and they're like, well, at least I know now. At least I have answers. At least I have something to work with, right? So that's not necessarily a bad response to that. Or let's say a loss that's not necessarily unexpected. I've talked before about feeling relief after a death or a loss, especially if it comes to somebody who has been suffering for a long time or who has just, if you're a caregiver, sometimes there's a feeling of relief because you don't have to worry about your whole life being gone while you're caregiving. And it feels gross, but it's perfectly normal and it's okay because you're a human being too. Okay, so let's talk about denial first. Again, denial is typically an initial response, but not always. There's exceptions to every rule, especially when it comes to grief, and illness, diagnoses, things like that. But denial tends to be your first reaction. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. We tend to experience a denial response to any type of extreme stress. It doesn't necessarily have to be a loss, but any type of like huge extreme stress, there's always a sense of denial. One example I can give is I was in a car accident back in 2018, I believe, and I was turning left out of a gas station and somebody was coming. I can't remember the details specifically. I don't think the person was running a red light, but they whipped around the corner very quickly and T-boned me. And at the moment, as I pulled out, I saw them in my peripheral vision, and then I saw them coming up to me. And there was a brief second, a split second where I thought, this isn't actually happening. I'm going to get out and they'll just miss me, which there was no way they were going to miss me. By the time I saw them, I could see the eyes of the driver. They were way too close and they were coming way too fast. There was no way they weren't going to hit me. But I had a moment of, oh no, I'll make this. It's fine. So denial is, it's a response to a lot of things that are going to be very stressful, very scary, very big in the moment. And that's just a way of our psyche of protecting us. It's actually a valid and good response to protect our psyche, our well-being. It gives you a little more time to adjust to what this new reality is going to be, whatever it might be. It's very hard for our brains to take in large information of something very traumatic or altering and just immediately go with it, right? Because it's a change. It's a huge shift. So our brain is just protecting us and saying, okay, nope, this isn't happening, to give it a little more time to process that it is. That's why denial isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just our psyche's way of protecting us. So with denial, let's talk about compartmentalizing. Compartmentalizing is something I do. Compartmentalization is just a way, it's another psychological defense mechanism where we keep our thoughts that seem to be conflicted very separate, isolated from each other. So like, let's say you receive a terminal diagnosis or you receive news that somebody close to you has just died, right? your brain kind of takes that information and puts it in a little box off to the side, which is part of denial, right? You're like, I'm going to put this information over here in this little box. And then you can just kind of focus on your quote unquote normal life before whatever this was, right? It's really just a form of dissociation, kind of a mild form of dissociation, but it's very similar if you're familiar with dissociation. It's just, again, it's a way of just like turning that off. It's taking that one bad thing, that diagnosis, that thing, and just turning it off for a little bit. Again, it's just another defense mechanism for your body or for your psyche. There's also selective attention, which comes with that. That's when you can hyper focus on other things. I know I do this, and it's also a form of denial. If I'm in a really bad situation, or if I'm coming close to a conflict, I'll try to change the subject or hyper focus on something else. If somebody's upset about something, I might, oh, your outfit's really nice today. Something like that. The situation isn't about this person's outfit or their clothing or whatever. It's just a way of me focusing on something else. And you could use this as a fact of a doctor is giving you your diagnosis or letting you know that your loved one has just died. And you instead shift focus on something else, like, oh, you're a really nice doctor. I'm just trying to give examples, but it's just a way of shifting focus, basically. Again, it's just another defense mechanism. There's also selective response, which is really just a way of saying someone purposefully picking a choice of what they're going to share or spend their mental focus on, right? Someone's selective response to a terminal diagnosis might be to just not talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. I'm going to have dinner with my neighbors and they know about this terminal diagnosis, but I just want to focus on, let's talk about our flower beds we put in this year. It's just a selective way. And again, that's also selective attention. It's all kind of compartmentalizing. It's all part of a denial response. There's also resistance or anger. That's another stage of grief we talked about with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it's just another way of denying. And a lot of times anger is the response with resistance. Not always. Again, there's exception to every single rule. So let's talk about acceptance now. Again, acceptance is one of those things that is looked upon as quote unquote good, right? It might not always be the case. Overall, yes, it's a good response to just say, okay, I have this loss, I have this diagnosis, I have this grief, I have this thing, this trauma that has happened. I accept it. Now I can work with it. And I talk about that with grief all the time. You cannot work on your grief and it will never go away until you accept that you have it and face it, right? Again, it's not necessarily always a great thing. Accepting too quickly can be a sign that somebody's avoiding things. If you're with somebody or you yourself has just immediately, and again, not always a bad thing, but if somebody has immediately accepted something and there's no real reason for it, you might want to keep an eye on them and make sure this isn't another way of them avoiding dealing with it by just saying, I accept it. Okay, yep, this happened. Cool, let's move on. Well, that might be their way of avoiding dealing with it, right? You could, if you've just been notified that someone close to you has died very unexpectedly and you just immediately go, okay, well, I guess they're gone. That's it then. No, that's not it. There is grieving to be done. You have to focus on your grief. So it's a little nitpicky. Overall acceptance is not a bad thing, but it can be if it's just another mechanism of avoidance. So there you go. Acceptance and denial. At the end of this article, it had some great questions, really more specifically for end-of-life doulas or caregivers or workers at the end of life in thinking about acceptance and denial with your clients. And I try not to talk about any of my clients on this podcast. I may share some anecdotal things, but overall, obviously with HIPAA, I'm not going to share detailed or personal information. But I have experienced both acceptance and denial with people that I have worked with. And I have one client that will always stick out in my brain that they specifically called me. They had been in stage 4 breast cancer for several years, honestly, and had been going through great treatments and fighting it, and finally just got to a point where they were done and they were tired, and this person told their children, "I'm ready to die." And they genuinely meant it. And I could tell in the first meeting with this client that it was very true. And this person was very, like, they knew, obviously their end was coming at some point because of this illness. But the fact that they finally were just like, I'm ready, man, let's just do this. Like, to me, that was beautiful. And I could tell it was genuine and it was well thought out. So that to me was a beautiful form of acceptance. So, all right. So I threw a lot of mumbo jumbo and big words at you. I hope you enjoyed that bit, and I hope you kind of got something out of that. Like I said, acceptance and denial have such attachments to them as good and bad. And I try to emphasize there are no good and bad emotions. Like, no emotions are good and bad. We tend to label things like that. It's like things like anger and sadness are bad, and joy and excitement are good. Well, not always. There's not. Sometimes anger is a super helpful response. Sometimes sadness is a super helpful response. So try not to label your emotions as good and bad. Okay? All right. So with that, I'm going to move on to the Death Deck, because of this topic, I'm going to go with the End of Life Deck. I'm going to pull something from the End of Life deck. Shuffle them up. Whoop! Sorry, I flipped a card right on the microphone. Okay. Ooh, okay. Final arrangements. Who is your chosen person in charge of making funeral or celebration of life arrangements? I never get tired of harping on everybody to get your stuff done ahead of time. Get your paperwork out there. But the great thing about funerals is you can plan them while you're still alive. So right now, I can't say for me, I don't really, I would choose my husband. I would prefer him to be the one to make any funeral or celebration of life plans. If it were to happen now, my parents obviously would have a say in these things as well. And I would hope they'd come to an agreement. But if I received a diagnosis or knew that my death was coming soon, I would do all this myself. I would plan this myself. I already know what I want done with my remains after I die. So if there's going to be a celebration of life, it's going to have to happen relatively quickly because I don't want embalming. Because I'm choosing to be composted. I'm sure I've mentioned that on here before. So that's my choice. So funeral's got to happen quick if you want to see my body. If I would kind of prefer that not happen, but I would never deny somebody that right. Sometimes seeing a person's body is a great form of closure. So as long as my remains aren't maybe scattered all over the place, then by all means, if you really need to look at my dead body, have at, but I don't know. Anyway, that's a bit morbid. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you got something out of it. And if upon listening to this, you heard something about your denial or acceptance, you're like, man, I am really struggling with this denial stuff. I think I need some help. Well, guess what? The folks at BetterHelp are there for you. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service. It's 100% online. And with BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with all your issues, be it acceptance or denial. To get started, you just go to their website, answer some questions, fill out a little survey about your needs and preferences, and then BetterHelp can match you with just the right therapist from their network. You can talk to your therapist however you're comfortable, text, phone, chat, video, and you can message your therapist at any time, schedule live sessions when it works for you. So if you've got a day job and you don't want to deal with that while you're at work, you can do it in the evenings. You can do it in the middle of the night. If 3 a.m. is when you need your therapy, let's face it, that's when a lot of things go bad, right? But with BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you would expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom picked for you. There's more scheduling flexibility and definitely more affordable. And you can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Nikki the Death Doula. And that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Nikki the Death Doula. Okay. Thank you guys so much. Please follow me on the socials. Follow me on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, wherever you listen to your podcasts, follow me. Leave reviews. If you listen to this on Apple products, that's a better way to leave a review. Spotify for some reason doesn't let you do much with that, and you do the stars, but also write a few words, because apparently that helps more people find me, and I want to help more people, with their grief. That's why I do what I do. And again, feel free to check me out on Patreon. It's patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula. You get grief affirmations. I will hopefully do special Q&As when I get enough followers. You get early access to the podcast without the ads. You don't have to listen to me talk about BetterHelp. And again, check me out on the socials. I'm Nikki the Death Doula on Facebook, Instagram, and I got a stupid Twitter that I never really look at, but feel free to do that. If you find me on Facebook, I post the podcast on the day they release so that you can have a conversation with other people. I would love to see people talking about the episodes there. So check that out. All right, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. And please remember, as always, your grief is yours. Your feelings are valid. And grief doesn't always have to suck.